Today, Household Financial Stress Update for July 2023. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news. Well, we've just run our market updates, and so we have information up to the end of July from our surveys. And today I'm going to walk you through some of the highlights, just reminding you, of course, that we've got a rolling survey of 52,000 households across the year, more than 4,000 new ones added each month. And as a result of that, we can get a good handle on what's really going on down on the ground. And of course, I'm particularly interested at the moment in cash flow of households and how they're tackling the pressures. Pressures, of course, coming from a combination of factors, including mortgage repayments going up thanks to the higher interest rates, high rents, and of course the broader cost of living pressures because of high inflation. And as I mentioned in my earlier show today, the true cost of living for households is significantly higher than that reported in the official inflation figures. Well, no surprise there, I guess. Anyway, what I want to do is to walk you through the main details of our analysis and to give you a little bit of a sense of what we're seeing in our numbers. And I will just mention, of course, that we do overlay our household segmentation so that we can see how different household groups in different locations are actually working. I guess you could call this a bit of a Rubik's Cube. You know, as you turn it, you get a different view of what's driving particular households to move in a particular direction. And I will also make the point that in our core market analysis, not only do we take information from our surveys, but other sources too, put them through the core market model. And this allows us then, thinking about scenarios, to come up with a view of where things may be heading. In other words, we can take our mortgage stress data, we can take the price trajectory, we can take the buying and selling intention data, we can take the migration data and the economic and CPI information, put it through the core market model, and obviously apply our scenarios. That gives us information down to a postcode level as well as a roll-up, and that means we can talk specifically about what's going on down in the individual postcode and what is driving the particular behaviour of households. And I will just mention that we're still running our one-to-one service, which is proving quite popular at the moment as people are trying to decode what's going on. And the point about this is that it's an individual confidential discussion with me about a particular suburb or postcode. I cannot give specific financial advice, of course, but I can discuss my data for a specific postcode or area and look at the underlying trends. And I can look at the stress data, the home price trends information, and also extract a bit of a view on where things may be heading based on our modelling. And we can take bookings at the moment. Typically these conversations about an hour via Zoom or phone. And there is a cost involved simply because, of course, there's a lot of research to be done to be able to have the conversation. We are booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead at the moment. If you are interested in a session, then contact me via the blog. The details are below. You can send me a message there and I can then work with you in terms of finding a mutually convenient time to have a conversation. I will also just mention one other thing, and that is that we should talk about the definition of stress, because there are many different mechanisms out there and many different definitions of stress, from 30% of income or maybe taxable income through to various underwriting metrics that the banks might use. But we define stress in cash flow terms: money in, money out. And if households have more outgoings, excluding one-off discretionary items, than income, we define them as stressed. If they have a mortgage, they're in mortgage stress. If renting, then they're in rental stress. Investors with cash flow pressures, we identify them as stressed investors. And we can also aggregate the data to estimate total financial stress at a postcode level. Now, I express them as a percentage of households, but also a count of households. And I think the latter is better because it gives more weight to those larger postcodes with large numbers of people being impacted. So here is the trend of mortgage stress for July 2023. And the first thing to notice is that the blue line, which is the rental stress number, has gone up again. It's now 68.84% of households in rental stress. That's as high as it's ever been and continues to climb into the stratosphere. The yellow line relates to mortgage stress, and again, that's up. We're now at 49.9% of borrowing households in mortgage stress. Again, that's as high as it's ever been. We're getting close to more than half of households with mortgage in difficulty. I've also included the other piece of information, which is the household debt to income ratio, which is what the RBA publishes from time to time. And the latest data from May shows that the number was 107.5. But of course, it's a bit artificial because only 1 in 3 households have a mortgage, and therefore you should probably multiply it by 3 to get the better ratio. It also includes SMEs in the numbers too, so it's a bit off, but it gives a little bit of a sense, and you can see here we're actually very close to peak levels of debt to income. Now this next slide shows you the July results. And what I've done here is to show them across each state and by mortgage stress type. So for example, if you have a look at the mortgage stress number, you can see there that the number at the bottom of the page is 1.92 million households in mortgage stress. And then if you go across the percentage, that's 49.88% of households. Now that's as high as it's ever been. Compare that with rental stress, which is more than 2.1 million households in rental stress across the country, which is 68.84% of those in rental stress. And then you've also got the investor stress and the financial stress numbers too. Importantly, we break them down by state, and we've also highlighted in yellow where they've moved up compared with last month. So you can see there that there's been a slight drop in mortgage stress in the ACT, and that's predominantly due to the fact that a lot of people have been refinancing in the ACT, extending their loans and therefore alleviating pressure. And the only other one to improve this month is in Tasmania for stressed investors, now at 14.2%. And the reason this has improved is because a number of landlords in Tasmania have been aggressively lifting rents, and that's helped to cover some of the costs of the outstanding mortgage and maintenance on the investment property. Now the next slide breaks it down by different cohorts, different types of households. And here what I've done is to highlight the largest relative proportion rather than actually the move from last month. So you can see there that young growing families down at the bottom, they are actually at 90.5 now in terms of percentage in mortgage stress. And that's very high for a couple of reasons. Firstly, of course, many of them are first-time buyers, and many of them bought relatively recently, and many of them bought recently at very low interest rates. So the interest rate movements, the mortgage cliff has really hit them very hard. That's also true of the battling urban disadvantaged fringe segments, which are significantly larger cohorts in terms of counts, but a slightly lower percentage. If I look at rental stress, we can see there that there's quite a high representation amongst older households, both wealthy seniors and also stressed seniors. Wealthy seniors are those who are funding themselves into their retirements. Stressed seniors are those on a pension. And it's interesting to see there, the reason that this pressure is building is more to do with the cost of living than interest rate rises. We also see first-generation Australians, the multicultural establishment groups, in rental stress at 77%, very much exposed, in fact, the most exposed of all of the cohorts. And this is reflecting the fact we've got very strong migration, so a lot of new people coming into the country that move into the rental sector and then find themselves in cash flow pressure. Some investors are also struggling, particularly exclusive professionals and young affluent. Now, the reason those are struggling is because they've got a bigger portfolio of investment properties. Investment properties are tending not to respond very well simply because the interest rate rises are bigger than the rises in rents that can be commanded. So we are seeing some stressed investors, particularly with multiple portfolios, now selling property. That's one of the reasons why listings are higher. And then the aggregate number, which is the last column, relates to the financial stress, which is the addition of mortgage, rental and investor stress, appropriately weighted for all households. And there we can see that the battling urban and the young growing family are actually the two cohorts that are most exposed, whether they're renting or whether they've got a mortgage or whether they are living in some other housing fashion. Now what I'm going to do is quickly go through the top postcodes. Firstly for mortgage, so you can see again that the postcode of Liverpool, which includes places like Chipping Norton and Warwick Farm, postcode 2170, is actually the most stressed postcode in the country. And then the next one in 2560 is Campbelltown, which includes Lemu and Woodbine and various other suburbs too. But Campbelltown and Liverpool in New South Wales is actually the most stressed couple of postcodes. The next one is 4350, which includes Toowoomba and areas around there, including Harristown. And there more than 12,000 households are now in difficulty. And then we go across to postcode 6065, which includes Tapping, Manly, Wanneroo and others there on the coast in Western Australia. Then we come back to postcode 2570, which includes Camden, Camden South, the Oaks, Grasmere, with more than 10,300. And then we go to postcode 3064, which includes Roxburgh Park, Donnybrook, Mickleham, with more than 10,300. And then another Victorian postcode, 3805, which includes Narrow Warren, Narrow Warren South, and Fountain Gate. And then we go to Pakenham and Pakenham Upper, 3810, and Berwick and Harkaway, postcode 3806. Now these are all high growth corridors on the outskirts of Melbourne. A lot of new building, a lot of growth, a lot of pain, a lot of pressure. Then we go to postcode 2765, Riverston, Marsden Park, Nelson, Oakville, Riverston. And they're more than 8,900 in difficulty. Now you'll see there that it's showing 100%. Now there is a little bit of a plus or minus in my modelling, plus or minus a couple of percent. So it might not be everybody, but it's certainly most people in this particular postcode. Then we go to Ballarat and Ballarat East and other suburbs around Ballarat, regional area of course. And that's postcode 3350 with more than 8,900. And then we come back to Victoria to postcode 3029, Toppers Crossing and Tarnit. And they're more than 8,800. And the last one on the top few is postcode 4306, which includes a range of postcodes around Pine Mountain, Black Soil and Ironbark and some other ones there. If we then move to rental stress, postcode 3000, the centre of Melbourne, has the highest count with more than 14,000. And then we come back to Liverpool, including Chipping Norton, Warwick Farm and Preston's, 2170 with more than 13,000. And then we come up to Toowoomba, Harriston and places there with more than 11,800. And then we come to Southport, Labrador in Queensland, 4215. That's of course around the Gold Coast. And then we come to Campbelltown, postcode 2560, including Aids, Appin and Lemu, more than 10,600. And then postcode 2017, including Zetland and Waterloo, with more than 9,600. And then we go to 2145, including Constitution Hill, Greystanes, Westmead, Pendle Hill, and South Wentworthville, with more than 9,600. And then we go to Ipswich, postcode 4305, including North Ipswich, Basin Pocket, Limestone Ridges, quite a big area there, more than 9,000. And then we go to postcode 4207, which includes Logan Village and Yatala. Then we go to postcode 4209, again Queensland, and Upper Coomera and Willow Vale. Then we go to postcode 2770, including Bidwell, Mount Druitt, Minchinbury and Lethbridge Park with more than 8,700. Then postcode 2148, including Blacktown, Kings Park and Prospect. Then we go to postcode 2250 on the Central Coast, including areas around Gosford. And then we go to Victorian postcode 3030, including Derrimut, Point Cook and Werribee. And Parramatta postcode 2150 in New South Wales. And finally postcode 4670, which includes various areas around Bundaberg. We then look at stressed investors. Not surprisingly, perhaps, with all of the stressed renters, we also find in the same postcode 3000, the centre of Melbourne is also experiencing a lot of stressed investors, followed by postcode 4215, including Southport and Labrador, more than 3,500. Then we go to Victorian postcode 3156, Ferntree Gully, Mountain Gate. And that's an interesting area because, of course, there's a lot of new development there as well, and a lot of relatively new property, a lot of it being rented, and a lot of people are finding that they can't get sufficient rent to cover the cost of the higher mortgage. Then we go to Wentworthville and Westmead, Greystanes, postcode 2145, and then Victorian postcode 3977, including Cranbourne and Cranbourne South, Junction Village and Skye. Then postcode 4670, including areas around Bundaberg, with more than 2,900. And then Fortitude Valley, postcode 4006, including Bowens Hill and Newstead. And then we come to the Northern Beaches in Sydney, with places like DY and Cromer and North Curl, 2099. And then Hornsby, 2077, and Hornsby Heights and Asquith. And then we get a postcode 4573, including Marcus Beach, Mount Coolum and Yarumba. And then we come on to postcode 3006 South Bank, just down the road from postcode 3000. And then we go across to Mandurah, Meadow Springs and areas like that. Interestingly, of course, this has been a high-stressed area for some time, and now we are seeing quite a few property investors struggling to make ends meet in the area, postcode 6210. Then we go to Denniston East and Putney and Ryde in New South Wales, 2112. And then postcode 2010, Surrey Hills and Darlinghurst. And then Woodbury, and that includes Thornton and Tomago, and they're with more than 2,200. And then postcode 3182, St Kilda in Victoria. And just to summarise, looking at financial stress, which is the aggregate of all of them, you can see there that postcode 2170 around Liverpool, Warwick Farm, Shipping Norton, has the prize for the most stressed postcode in the country. Then comes Toowoomba, postcode 4350, and then Campbelltown, 2560, the centre of Melbourne, postcode 3000, and then Craigieburn, Donnybrook, Roxburgh Park and Mickleham, postcode 3064, then Derrimut, Point Cook and Werribee, postcode 3030, and then Hoppers Crossing and Tarnit, postcode 3029. Back to New South Wales, including Mount Druitt, Minchinbury, Lethbridge Park and Bidwell, postcode 2770. And then postcode 4305 around Ipswich, and postcode 4215 around the Gold Coast, Southport, Labrador and Churn Park. And then we go to postcode 3350, which includes areas around Ballarat. And then Bellwood Park and Springfield, postcode 4300 in Queensland. Then across to Western Australia, postcode 3065, which includes Tapping and Wanneroo. Then postcode 3810, Pakenham and Upper Pakenham in Victoria. Blacktown, postcode 2148 in New South Wales. Then back to Cranbourne, Cranbourne East, Junction Village and Skye, postcode 3977, a very high growth corridor there. Then we come back to New South Wales, including Wentworthville, Greystanes and Westmead, postcode 2145, and postcode 3805, Fountain Gate, Narrow Warren, and Narrowmoor and South in Victoria. Now, the point I want to make is that many of these postcodes are actually high growth corridors. In other words, people have been buying quite recently, often with home and land packages, actually often crammed in. And of course, leverage up to the hilt, home builder was part of that as well. And they got mortgages at the point when mortgages were around 2%. Now, of course, the average mortgage is 6% or 7%. And indeed, the ABS today highlighted the fact that the typical mortgages doubled nearly in recent times. So this is one of the points of pressure that we're seeing coming into our surveys. Now, of course, many households continuing to make their repayments no problem at all. But in these particular areas, these high growth corridors, these hotspots, there are more and more people finding the cash flow pressures significant. That doesn't mean that they're not going to pay their mortgages, but they're having to hunker down, they're having to put more on credit cards, they're having to use their savings if they've got them. Remember, my definition is money out is bigger than money coming in. And that can go on for a period, but if it goes on too long, then it can create a real problem. Now, the next thing I just want to touch on is our scenarios. So scenarios are a way of exploring different futures and thinking about the consequences. It's not a forecast, but it does help to think about some of the issues that are going on. None of the scenarios may turn out to be right, things change, and we use a framework driven from our core market model. And there are some different outcomes. I'll show you sort of three of them today. So here are the three scenarios. The best is what I call the Goldilocks zone. So this is where rates stay at 4.1% and they fall over the next year. Inflation eases ahead of RBA expectations and wages rise faster, and no recession in Australia. So that is really everything going right. So the next one is our base case, which I call a soft landing. Rates do go a little higher, let's say 4.35%, which would give a mortgage rate somewhere between 6.75 and 7.5%. And then they would stay high over 2023 and 2024, while inflation stays above target until 2025, which is what the RBA is forecasting, and no recession in Australia. And the worst is what I call the nightmare scenario. This is where rates rise higher, above 4.35%, which means that mortgage rates are high too. They stay high into 2024 along with inflation, but wages growth ultimately stalls due to recession here, and then they cut rates, but it's too late. And of course, what I can then do is to drill down into particular postcodes and look at all of the information from my modelling and also the scenarios. This is just a sample from April, and I can have this conversation around every specific postcode. And in fact, next Tuesday, the 8th of August, we'll be running a show where we can walk through some specific examples down to the postcode level. So make a note of that and come and join us next Tuesday. Now, I will also mention a couple of other things. It's quite often the case that people don't recognise that they're in significant pressure until it's too late. And then the question is, what do I do? Well, you can certainly talk to the bank. If you've got a hardship question, they have to help. They are obliged to help. But it is sometimes useful to get independent advice. And you must be really careful here, because there are websites that claim to be able to help but will often charge. But I recommend the National Debt Helpline on 1-800-007-007. This is a government-backed scheme, and they are very expert at helping to figure out what's going on and also to figure out whether there are things that can be done to help. So make a note of that number if you're in difficulty, 1-800-007-007. And it's worth saying again, the sooner that you actually begin to understand your finances, look at your cash flow, think about what you can prioritize and restructure and refinance, then it's worth doing. I'd also make the point that the banks, of course, are willing and able to extend the life of the loan. And sometimes that makes sense because it does reduce repayments, but it also increases the amount of interest that you end up paying. And if you are at a situation where your finances are in severe pressure, it may only be a short-term fix. I quite often see in my surveys people who've refinanced once or twice. Sometimes, in fact, they've also pulled down equity. But ultimately, it gets to the point where they still have to sell. But my read is that more households are actually having to think quite hard and perhaps are being forced to sell one of the reasons why listings are continuing to go up quite significantly. So I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour of what I'm finding in my leisure surveys. It's not good news. More households are getting into difficulty. More households are trying to work more hours to be able to generate more income. Wages growth is still pretty anemic in Australia thanks to the high migration. And of course the RBA is very worried about wages growth. But the real test for me will be what happens with employment. If unemployment starts to rise, and the RBA is saying maybe up to 4.5% over the next year or so, then we're going to see more people getting into difficulty and being forced to sell. But meantime, what we're seeing at the moment is that many people are prioritising, are trying to make sure that they continue to pay their rent or their mortgage, and are foregoing other expenditures, spending less at the shops, perhaps raiding savings, or perhaps putting more on credit cards and other forms of short-term credit. And interestingly, of course, in the US, the amount of credit has shot up dramatically in recent times for similar reasons. So, mark your diary for next Tuesday if you'd like to go into more detail and look at individual postcodes, and I'll go through the scenarios in more detail and show you how they all work. But at least it gives you a bit of a stake in the ground as to what we're seeing in our surveys. And as I say, unfortunately, it's not great news. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.